And now let us plunge in at the very beginning. Now, why do we say that philosophy and science started with the Greeks in the 6th century BC? Because after all, there had been human beings for a long, long time before that. There had been flourishing civilizations long before this time. And surrounding Greece. There were the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and many others. And they had acquired a fair amount of primitive knowledge in fields like astronomy, mathematics, and so on. But none of them except the Greeks had anything that you would call philosophy. Now, of course, they had philosophy implicitly, by implication. Every human being has some kind of code of values in view of reality and knowledge. But theirs was essentially by implication, these non-Greek civilizations. Insofar as it was explicit, it was metaphorical, enormously mystical, mythological, filled with parables and dogmas and so on, and nothing that you would call a self-conscious or systematic or critical or rational attempt to raise and answer philosophic questions. In this latter sense, philosophy as a self-conscious, disciplined, rational phenomenon began in the 6th century BC in Greece. Now, what prevented all these other civilizations from developing philosophy? Two things. In regard to their view of reality, they believed that true reality was some other dimension, superior to this one. They believed accordingly that nothing in this world was intelligible. This world was a series of events operated by the gods behind the scenes in another dimension. And there was no way of trying to explain or understand this world. All you could do is bow, pray, and beg, because this world was basically simply a byproduct of another dimension. They had the same view with regard to ethics. Morality was simply a series of injunctions by the appropriate gods, and you could make no more sense of morality by reason than you could of physical phenomena. And therefore, there was no possibility of understanding the world. In other words, they were supernaturalist cultures, and they meant it. A consequence of that was a second point which prevented them from developing philosophy. They held that this life and this earth are not only unintelligible, but also evil. If you want to get their perspective, and this varied to some extent depending on the civilization, but it's a pretty fair statement. Imagine that you are caught in a jail cell. Now, you will not, in the normal case, have a passion to discover the molecular structure of the bars or the viscosity of the air and so on and so on. You will want to get out of the jail cell. That will be your overriding concern. And that was the overriding concern of most of the non-Greek cultures. This is perhaps best typified in regard to Egypt. The thing you think of course, is the pyramids. And they are a monument not to life, but to death. And the thing in Egypt was not how good a life could you live, but how good a death could you die. In other words, these previous cultures took religion seriously. And the result was a complete stultification or failure to develop philosophic ability. Greece was, however, an exception. As one commentator puts it, it was I'm quoting now, it was, quote, an oasis almost completely surrounded by barbarian custom and savage practice, unquote. Now, why? What about the Greeks made it possible? Well, it's two things. Partly political, partly religious. Now, on the political, I'll ask you to see ordinary histories which are reliable on this point. What it amounts to is that the Greeks by the 6th century BC, owing to various factors, had achieved a comparative degree of political freedom. The powerful monarchies of the earlier centuries had given way to the freer city-states, and in that climate, philosophy and science could develop. I might note parenthetically that wherever government remained strong, philosophy never took root. And the classic example of that is Sparta, which never had a philosophic thought, so far as you can tell from what they left. So if political conditions are one, the other is religion. Now, the Greeks had a very peculiar religion. The religion, as you know, of the gods of Mount Olympus. And according to that view, The gods were not creators of the world. They were not rulers or directors of the world. The Greeks believed, all Greeks believed, that the universe had always existed, that it was a natural phenomenon, that the gods are simply one natural evolutionary development along with everything else. The gods, therefore, could not interfere in any major way with the operation of the universe. The Greeks had a saying, which is dubious, but nevertheless they had it, nothing in excess. And the idea was that applies to the gods also. They have their own place, and as long as they keep their place, okay, but if they get out of hand, reality will fix them. So the gods were, in effect, streamlined men. They were elder brothers to man. In effect, they were not something you groveled before. They were not omnipotent. They were not omniscient. You were not to fear them. As a result, the Greeks held that this world is intelligible, and it was a good place in which to live. You know their statues. That was their concept of what is realistic. They thought that this was a good world. It was a friendly, happy place. You could achieve enjoyment and ease during life on earth, and therefore they wanted to make something of life on earth. Now, they believed in a shadowy immortality of sorts, but they didn't yearn for it. For instance, in one of Homer's works, the ghost of Achilles says in a very representative statement that he would rather live on earth as the slave of a man, even of a poor man, which was a big disgrace to be the slave of a poor man, rather than to be the king and the ruler of the whole other world. And that is a typically Greek attitude. You see a very pro-this life attitude. There were exceptions, as we'll see later tonight, but this was the dominant trend. For these reasons, because knowledge was possible, because it was worthwhile, the Greeks developed a love of knowledge. They developed philane for Sophia. They took ideas seriously, and we had for the first time the development of the civilization of thinkers. Now, what did they think about? The first things that interested them were twofold, two different phenomena. Now, I emphasize that we're at a period where we know essentially nothing. That is to say, they know essentially nothing. There's no philosophy yet, and no systematic science. So, of course, the first observations are going to be, by their nature, very elementary. The first two things that interested them, if you're taking notes, I would take this down, are change and multiplicity. Now, let's explain what we mean by each of those things, because they're going to run throughout the course. By change, we mean anything that happens, mental or physical. Any occurrence, any event, any motion, any activity. Winter, and then spring, and then summer, and then fall, and so on in a cycle, that's change. A thing is born and grows and reaches its maturity and then dies and decays and turns to dust. That's change. Life and death, waking and then sleeping. Day becomes night. Wet things become dry, and cold things become hot, and light things become dark, etc. You know about rivers rushing off to where they're going and landslides. The idea is clear. Now, what interested them about change? Well, I'll take an example that they obviously did not use, not having paper matches from Nevada. I'll engage in a process of change before your eyes. For those hearing this on tape, I'm lighting a match. Now, here is a process of change. Now, you observe this match that I have. All right. Now it's undergone a process of change. In fact, two of them. There was something white and flickering and hot, and now it's vanished, and something black and so on has taken its place, and hot. Now that's a simple example of change, and the questions that they wanted to know is, how do we make sense of this? Where did the flame come from? It wasn't there, and now it is. Where did the smoke come from? It wasn't there, and now it is. Where did the white tip go to? The cold, hard white tip, which was there and now isn't. How did we get from one state to the other state? How are the two states related? That was the first question that they asked with regard to the phenomenon of change. And now, with regard to multiplicity, what does that mean and what was the question? Multiplicity is a big word for many. The Greeks were impressed by the fact that there are a great many things making up the world, the physical world. There are shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. If there were only cabbages, this question wouldn't have come up, but there's all kinds of different things. And the question that they asked is, what is the relationship between all of these different things? There must, they thought, be some sort of common denominator uniting or tying together all these different things. Could it be, they asked in effect, not using these examples, could it possibly be that the only thing there is to say about bananas is that they're made out of banana stuff, and that's it? And tomatoes are made out of tomato stuff, television is made out of television set stuff, and that's it. No, they said that's impossible. There must be some sort of relationships tying all these many things together, making them part of one universe. After all, some of them change into others, so the two issues are tied together, you see. Water becomes ice. So there have to be something in common to make it possible for one of them to become the other. Well, how are we going to do this? Now, against this background, we can introduce the father of philosophy, the man who put the first answer forth to these questions, and as far as we know, was the first one to ask the question. His name is Thales, T-H-A-L-E-S. He flourished in 585 BC. He's regarded as the father of philosophy with a capital F. As I say, we have only 4 sentences of his left, so you could become a world authority on Thales. He comes from a town in Asia Minor called Miletus, and therefore the school that he founded is called the Milesians, M-I-L-E-S-I-A-N-S. And he put forth essentially the following hypothesis. Now I'm reconstructing, but it seems to be justified. He put forth the idea that there is one fundamental stuff which makes up the entire universe. Everything. Bananas, philosophers, and sealing wax. And everything else are made of this one ingredient, which he called, or subsequently was called, the world stuff. The stuff that makes up the world and everything that's in it. Now, this view that there is only one stuff which makes up the world came to be called monism. M-O-N-I-S-M, from the view that you see that there's only one such stuff. Now, his reasoning seemed to be that if there was one stuff, we could explain how everything is related. All the many things will be just many different forms of the one stuff. And we'll be able to explain change, because change will simply be one form of that stuff becoming another form of that stuff. And therefore, we'll have a common denominator uniting and tying everything together. Now, of course, there's no warrant for the view that there's only one such stuff. But the approach that he is attempting here was of incalculable importance. It is the approach which to this day is the essence of the scientific approach. The attempt to find unity amid diversity, to find common denominators to enable us to integrate a whole wealth of disparate observations. The whole process of physics, for instance, has been started with a whole series of laws, and then Newton comes along and shows that you can reduce them to just a few laws, and Einstein to just a fewer laws, and so on, constantly seeking for unity in the face of diversity. The same is true of chemistry, which took the endless stuffs of the world and tried to find them in 90 or 100 odd elements, and then the physicists came in and tried to reduce those elements down to 8 or 10 building blocks, and so on. That attempt was inaugurated by Thales. And what he was looking for, if we use the Greek terminology, was he wanted the one in the many. The one in the many. That's clear, right? I would write that down if you're taking notes, because that's very important. And another way in which it was described was, it is the permanent amid the changing. The thing which is always there, and which is all the changing things are simply different forms of. Now, as to Thales' view as to what is the one in the many, what is the world stuff, it is, of course, very primitive. He held that it was water. He is sometimes jocularly described as a hydromonist, but that is carrying terminology to the point of insanity. He held it on the basis of observations which are sensible within this frame of knowledge. Water was the one thing he could observe that could take on solid, liquid, and gaseous form. Water seemed to be able to turn into air, because when you put a dish of it out, the next day it was gone, and all there was left was air. That's, of course, evaporation, a phenomenon he didn't know about. Earth seemed to turn into water, because if you dig in the earth, you find water. Of course, underground springs, which they regarded as earth turning into water. Water can become solid, as in the form of ice. Water dries up, and sometimes you find little wriggling living creatures, which suggests a central connection between water and life, and so on. Now, for all of that type of reasons, he said that water is the one in the many. Now, he's wrong, of course, but the importance of Thales is the question and the category of answer, not the specific answer. He was the one who established the idea of a naturalistic approach to the world rather than a supernaturalistic one, who dispensed with the supernatural, with gods, as explanatory principles, who introduced the idea that there are natural laws in the nature of things governing what takes place, and that we can account for the entire phenomena that we observe by reference to one logical reality. And he also suggested by implication that the indispensable precondition of it all was sense observation, but that alone would confront us with would tell us the nature of reality. Now, of course, all of this is simply implied from the 4 sentences that he left us, but it was essentially there. So much for the father of philosophy. He had a number of successors in the Milesian school, which we are going to pass over without mention. You can get them from a history book if you want. Some of them weren't as good as he was, and some were more advanced. And they speculated that the world stuff wasn't water. One of them thought it was air, one of them thought it was earth, and another one had his own weird view as to what it was. But in any event, that's as detailed as we can pass over. Science, philosophy, although very primitive, was nicely started.